talking anyway. So, thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here today. I spoke last year as well, and I enjoyed seeing all the research going on. Those of you that have seen me speak before, I sometimes meander outside of architecture a bit to make a point which is relevant to architecture. And today I wanted to briefly talk about research as an agency for innovation. And in other words, I think that research, practice, and innovation are inextricably linked. I first wanted to show a couple of slides here, which some of you may have seen this recently. Someone named Matt Might, who is an instructor, an American architecture instructor, gave a series of diagrams to talk about, this is explicitly about having a PhD, what it means to have a PhD. And he shows this diagram first and says, imagine a circle that contains all human knowledge. And then by the time you finish elementary school, you know a little, you know a bit of a core. And so I'll first say as a caveat that I realize this is not a PhD symposium, but research is very related to that. There are a lot of correlates. It says that when you finish high school, you know a bit more. And then when you go into undergrad, you get a bachelor's degree, you gain a certain amount of speciality. So you've begun to now branch into, you've chosen a major, you've done a bit more specificity. And then a master's, assuming you were to carry on with a background into the same field, you would then begin to deepen that speciality within the field. Now, of course, if you're a non-background major, it's a similar thing, but you possibly have one nodule in one direction and another one in a slightly different direction, or sometimes overlap. And then he argues that by reading research papers, it takes you to the edge of human knowledge on that given topic. And so part of you all being here today is seeing other people speak and gaining more knowledge toward this trajectory. I want to stop on this slide for one moment and speak a bit about the idea of, in order to innovate, needing to understand the fundamentals as well as the body of research that currently exists. Two examples that come to mind for me are Picasso, for example. When he created the Cubist movement, it wasn't arbitrarily out of the blue. He didn't reach the periphery of our body of knowledge, our body of technique. He had been trained classically and was a very good Renaissance-style perspective painter, and began to question exactly how we could go beyond that. And so he was standing on this platform to push out further beyond that. Another interesting thing is a cultural critic was once asked, if aliens came to Earth, what would we show them? What would we show them on Earth? And if you could show them one thing that show our innovation, and he said, I would play Miles Davis's Kind of Blue album for them. That's the most incredible accomplishment of mankind. And Miles Davis was also classically trained pianist and learned the fundamentals and kept pushing and pushing. And all of his innovation came from a certain body of knowledge, this corpus of knowledge. He was then able to get out beyond that. So, having said that, with innovation, it can be controversial. In any type of innovation, you're disrupting an existing system. You're challenging the norms that exist. And you can get feedback both directions. You get resistance to that. You get people that stick to the conventional way of doing things or thinking of things. So I encourage research for the sake of leading to an innovative conclusion or argument, but not necessarily, not being different for different sake. So I'm not encouraging you to be a Lady Gaga of architecture where you're just trying to be different because no one's done that. It's thinking on building on this platform of what's there, and then once you get to that point, then challenging that. So this diagram series carries on, where he shows that once you're at the boundary, you begin to really focus, and you can push that boundary for years until one day that boundary starts to give way, and you start to make a difference in that boundary of knowledge. You actually contribute something new. And that is again more of so your PhD is really that sort of thing. And we're all within this spectrum, right? And so your world looks like this, okay, once you reach that level. But this happens even in practice as well. Within practice, we become very specialized, we can do niche sort of thing. So the world looks different to you now. You're very, very aware of this particular niche. But then, within the larger spectrum of things, you've made a difference, but it's a different and very specific thing. This is what research leads toward. And what I want to conclude with is that it's something that I mention occasionally that I think is very important to remind ourselves of. In the field of architecture, it can be extremely competitive, both in academia and in the profession. And sometimes classes and studios are even geared that way. And while I think that competition can be very good to help us sharpen our senses and help us improve in a lot of ways, it also can be quite counterproductive. And it's important to step away and look at the bigger picture of you being part of an advancement of a body of knowledge or a body of techniques of certain research and design. And I would like to conclude with a quote from Baz Luhrmann, who says, it's a strange source to make a quote from the Sunscreen song, but he says, "Don't congratulate yourself too much, or berate yourself either. Your choices are half chance, and so are everybody else's. Don't waste your time with jealousy. Sometimes you're ahead, sometimes you're behind. The race is long, and in the end, it's only against yourself." So for me, architecture is best in collaboration. It's best when we build on each other's ideas. And that's what today is about. This afternoon is about from Sarah to Heather to Clay to William to Igor and Kiara. It matters that you're here. It matters that you're here to be here as this, to build off of one another. And ultimately, you're all working to expand the relevance of architecture as we know it. Thanks.
I'll just talk for a minute without the presentation, and then we'll get the presentation. It's going to take a few minutes because they're going to get it from the email. Let me just introduce myself. I'm new faculty here. Sarah Lopez, I'm an architectural historian. But I very much am on the edges of disciplinary knowledge, so I really appreciated Matt's introduction and very much relate with this little tiny bump that is the space I occupy, right? That PhD, hopefully pushing the boundaries of architectural history and the way we do architectural research in general. Just as a plug, I'm going to give a presentation today that's about part of my research project currently on Mexican migration and remittances and the remittance landscape, and I'll talk about what that is. But the bigger picture is that I look at U.S. cultural landscapes as a way of understanding an ordinary everyday built environment, as a way of understanding social history. So this is a very different research presentation than some of the stuff we're going to see later today that's much more invested and involved in some of the innovation that's happening within the architectural profession. I'm completely talking here about social history, mapping techniques, doing ethnography as ways of understanding the built environment as a social medium, right? And in terms of the history part, I do use some archival material to do historical research, but I also use ethnography because a lot of the subjects that I study to understand how the built environment tells us different stories haven't been recorded in traditional archives. So we have to use ethnography, participant observation, and interviewing as techniques to unearth those stories. So see, that was, now I'm ready with my PowerPoint, right? Perfect timing. The remittance landscape, a built environment history of Mexican migration. And here you see 3 images. We're going to talk primarily about houses today. This is a remittance house that you see here on the left. This doesn't really show up too well there, does it? A little bit. The middle is a rodeo, and it's just an example of a performative event that is subsidized by remittances. And on the far right is a very hard to read map, an urban map plan. And one of those streets there is called Calle Hijos Ausentes, the street of absent sons and daughters, just to show you the extent to which the landscape in Mexico is shaped by migration processes. So I'm using this term remittance. What is it, right? Remittance is simply an economic term that's used to reference a sum of money or formally a quantity of an item transferred from one place to another. So a remittance can be national, right? A remittance can be money that you send from California to family members in Texas. It can be international. Remittances are global, and they've been having increasing awareness and popularity in terms of all different kinds of professionals talking about remittances. From architects to very much developers, global activists. We see here a map of remittance flows. I particularly look at remittance flows going from the United States to Mexico, right? From people, family, migrants who live here, sending money to their hometowns. That is the 4th largest flow in the world, by the way. It used to be the 3rd, just got bumped down by the Philippines. India and China are the first 2 largest flows. In terms of my methods, I talked about using the material built environment, using everyday architecture as the material from which I pull my research. So here's one mapping technique that I use. This is a cognitive map that I did in a small town in rural Mexico. I asked a woman to walk around with me door to door. This is a small pueblo of 400 people. and to tell me which houses were built with dollars, and which ones were built with pesos, and which ones were remodeled, a mixture of dollars and pesos. And I shaded the plots, the darker being dollar houses, the middle gray being a mixture of income flows, and the lightest being pesos. To just show you how extensive this flow of money is in the built fabric in the places that I'm looking at. And we could study this for all kinds of other relationships, right? Of course, different spatial relationships. Like, well, does that dollar flow affect the architecture that's been being built on that plot? How might that affect the way the house looks across the street, etc. That map was made in a high immigrant region in Mexico, so primarily my research focuses on Jalisco, which is one of these dark purple states, where we have one of the highest rates of emigration to the United States from that state in Mexico. And then I like to show this image because it's a happier, younger version of myself, relaxing, doing formal research. And I also like to show it because it captures the kind of gender dynamic of doing ethnography in the remittance landscape, which is I'm there interviewing a group of albañiles who are actually responsible for building the rodeo arena that the stairs of which we're sitting on, all funded by dollars. So let's focus in and just look at houses. Houses built by migrants, financed by dollars, right? And think about the different formal characteristics of these houses and how we can think about them also socially and spatially. Houses in terms of social relationships very much are talking about distanced relationships between family members, right? So here we see the women, the mother and daughters in the remittance house in Mexico on the left, and the father and son in a bodega in a small store in Oakland, California on the right. And it is on the right in Oakland where they're earning the capital that they're sending to the half of their family that remains in Guanajuato, Mexico, on the left. So it's interesting that even though the remittance landscape is really quite male in many ways, in terms of the albañiles building it, it is a lot of the women in Mexico who are making decisions about how to spend that money. Remittance houses also signify really radically different kinds of investments. And some of these are strategic investments for retirements that don't otherwise exist in these communities in Mexico. So here you see two different strategies. These are both remittance houses, despite the very different scale of them. On the left, you see a small house that was built by a seasonal farm worker who lived in the United States on and off, back and forth for 30 years. With the money that he accumulated, he built 2 houses in his hometown that he rents out for a small sum, a monthly sum, a small income. And then built himself this house with dollars that he lives in and has retired in, right? So he's sort of taking care of his own retirement in that way, in a place where it wasn't otherwise taken care of for him. On the left, you see what's kind of a monster remittance house, and more of a party pad, if you will, because it was built by a landscape worker who does landscaping in Malibu, California, and built this with some surplus money that he had, but he can only go there and enjoy it for 1 month out of the year. So otherwise, it's empty and has to be, just maintained when he comes home for that 1 month out of the year. The reason he has to keep that distance from the house and from enjoying it is because he has to keep earning the money that he earns in California to maintain the lifestyle that he has for 1 month out of the year when he comes here, and does spend quite a bit of money. I learned about those activities from the man next door, not from him himself, so that should be fact-checked. Time is also, of course, a big issue with looking at the remittance landscape. A lot of the aspirations and intentions of migrants do not end up coming to fruition, right? So we see houses that are partway finished, have been abandoned, potentially in progress. It's often hard to know exactly what state the house is in or what kind of particular story it relates to. This is a house, maybe not a house, maybe a different use that I saw on the side of a road as I traveled many times back and forth throughout a year in Jalisco. And it looked that way for the year, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. It hadn't been modified. And I asked people if that house had been that way, to get a sense of for how long. And the story that I heard was, well, it's been that way really forever. We think it's abandoned. And I actually went back to that site 4 years later. You can barely see it in this photograph. But there is a steel beam that was added. Can you see that? On the top of the house, right? So on these columns here. So 4 years later, it was evidence of the fact that actually, despite kind of local knowledge and what people thought, which was that this had been a project that had, gone halfway or less than halfway, somebody was still intentionally devoting their funds and hoping to complete the project. Formally, the remittance landscape is interesting because what we might call the Pueblo vernacular or the everyday ordinary architecture in rural Mexico is being highly disrupted, right, and changed by not only migration, there are other processes at work as well, but migration is one of them. Some of the characteristics I'm talking about are the continuous facade that you see in rural and urban Mexican cities and towns, the attached Spanish-style roof, the courtyard house, for example, is a prototype. A lot of the remittance houses rupture, create a rupture, break this kind of architectural fabric. So here, what you're looking at is actually 3 different homes, right, where the home that the migrant built with dollars actually pushes back that original facade wall, puts up a fence, has a small carport there so that the car can be driven in and open onto a front doorway, and then has a small amount of shrubbery there as sort of a reference to a front yard. In urban environments, the idea and the desire to distinguish oneself, is also prevalent. If you look at this slide, can you guess which house is the remittance house, right? So there's one onion dome on the street, and indeed, the exact request from the client to the architect was just make something that stands out. He didn't say build me an onion dome, or he didn't actually have a photograph, as we'll see in some other examples. He wanted to stand out from the rest of the urban fabric, and the architect beautifully accomplished this. We see all kinds of mixing of architectural styles and details and ornamentation in these remittance homes. And in some way, as an architectural historian, it almost reminds me of the Victorian home era here in the United States, where there really is this interest in this individualistic expression, of the facade. So here you just see 2 examples. You can't see the picture window that's behind that rose bush, but you have to take my word for it that there is one. And this kind of new transitional space, right? The house is no longer in this left photograph up against the street or sidewalk, but there's the gate, and there's the front yard, and there's the entryway, and the garage. There's also a whole different idea about freestanding homes, right? So these homes are built next to each other, and the sides are not articulated, right? There's no windows or painting or ornamentation happening on the sides of the houses. So you see the way that this particular person is dealing with that pink stepped-up wall. A lot of these homes are using a lot of cultural and craft traditions that are regional and have been used for a long time. Some of these windows that might look very modern are actually not prefabricated, standardized products, but are made to order. I'm also interested in studying, well, how do these homes, get commissioned, right? What are the different venues and avenues for requesting to build this kind of long distance architecture from below, if you will? And here's one such method. This is an albañil who, his client is also a gardener in Los Angeles. The gardener took a photograph of a house in Los Angeles that he works on that he particularly loved and wanted replicated. And he gave that photograph to the albañil in his hometown and just said, make it happen. Now, the gardener photographed the back of the house, the pool side, right? So what you're seeing there is the back of the house. But he said to the albañil, make it happen, I want this to be the facade, the front of the house. And so we have retained the monumental columns and a couple of other features, but obviously in terms of a spatial logic or the way the plan relates to the facade or relates to the back of the house, that's all going to change. Right? Another method, for example, is this man, Sergio Robles, who looked at a home pattern book, found this house, sent away $600 to buy that plan, and then took the plan and the photograph down to Mexico and had it exactly replicated. And even down to the colors that the house was painted and to some of the landscaping, which is hard to read, in the front of the house there as well, which was a really big feat to try to find the same plans. Of course, the emergence of the remittance house is also very much about manifesting materially the growing economic inequalities between those who migrate and those who do not, right? So we see in rural and urban locations in Mexico, and this is a global phenomenon, right, around the world, the way that dollars is changing what's possible for the people from the hometowns from which they come. This is the peso house next to the house. In addition to looking at homes, and I'm just going to touch upon this briefly for the sake of time, I also look at public projects, civic projects, infrastructure, right? So I kind of take some of the different ideas that I've laid out in the domestic arena and in home building and look at it in these other arenas. Here, this is a diagram of migrant social clubs, which in the United States will send money collectively. So rather than sending money to your wife and having her build a house, right, a larger pot of money gets sent to a hometown to build a library, let's say. There's a government program in Mexico that works with this as well to increase the funds. These are just examples of some of the projects that have been built that way. A church that was remodeled, right, with the tower reconstructed. This happens to be a colonial church in a very interesting town. What they call the kiosco or the gazebo, right, in the middle of the plaza of the hometown. The original peso kiosco here was knocked down, and a dollar remittance one was built. And in fact, the entire plaza was rebuilt. And in fact, the migrants from this town have actually told me that one day they will rebuild the entire town, right? So they started with the center, and then they rebuilt the plaza, but their aspirations are really to keep going and to really just sort of remake that material landscape from which they come with the fruits of their labor up here in the north. And then finally, part of my whole interest is in how do we study architecture, right? How do we, not only let's look at ordinary everyday built environments to study architecture, not only in my case, let's look at migration processes to study architecture, but let's do this in multiple sites and multiple locations, right? So we can't just understand Mexico by looking just at Mexico. And I also argue we can't just understand the United States anymore by looking just at the United States. We have to actually look at multiple locations and link them with the kinds of processes like remittances that I was looking at. So here's one built environment manifestation of remittances in Chicago, right, which is different clubhouses from where all the migrants organize. And some of these involve design and either redesign of interiors, or some migrants in cities like Chicago have actually tried to build, clubhouses and have them have specific representations. And some of them are just repurposed buildings, right, that they put signs on and different things. So you see here 4 different examples of different Mexican states, Michoacán, Jalisco, Zacatecas, and Guerrero, all representing the clubhouses of those migrants from those states in Mexico. Beyond migrants, it's just interesting for us also to remember that the built environment of the United States is sometimes built by and invested in by other national states, other national governments, right? So this is an arch that was paid for by Mexican statesmen. And they built this arch in Chicago as an inauguration to Little Village, which is the Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. And part of that is sort of just saying, we want our migrants that are in the United States to remain, interested in and attached to their homeland, right? And we're going to make that investment in the urban environment in America as a way of further cementing that idea, right? So these are all the sorts of processes that I think are related to this concept of a remittance landscape that I talked about. So thank you for your time, and hopefully now when you see these kinds of Western Union signs and currency exchange signs, you'll have lots of other competing images pop up. Thanks.
Okay, I'm Heather. I'm an MR1 student here with a background. I have the privilege of having Sarah for a class this semester. I highly recommend her. This past summer, I went to Ecuador with Architects Without Borders, or I'll refer to them a lot as ASF probably in the presentation, which is Architects Sans Frontières, the French version. It's the chapter out of London, and one of the more active chapters in the world. I actually found out about this opportunity through Fernando that I was also a professor here through the Ramas. And I grew up in Quito, Ecuador, so for me this was just an exciting opportunity to be able to connect what has been my academic background in architecture with my upbringing in Ecuador. This was a lot of fun. What we did is we went to Ecuador.
Turn it on. Turn it on. In the back. On the back. On the back.
So where is Ecuador? Ecuador is in South America, right on the equator. So you see on the map there, and then we were right outside of. So Quito is the capital city up in the Andes, really high, really cold region, but also a very growing region, just like most metropolitan cities in Latin America. About a population of about 2 million people. And Los Pinos is on the south side, about an hour outside of the city. So ASF has developed a methodology, and it's led by a bunch of researchers that teach researching academics in different institutions in London mostly. And they've developed this, and they've gone to several countries in the world, and this time they went to Ecuador. Their methodology is based on 4 different phases. The first one being diagnosing. So you go in and look at what the present conditions are. Then you work, at every phase you're always working with people in the community. So the second phase, they're dreaming, you're asking them what do they want in their future, what are their largest goals, how do they want to go about this. And then developing, in which you come up with alternatives and consensus. We always dream bigger than we can actually build, we can actually afford. So how do we find something that actually meets our goals, or meets their goals, but it's still within their dreams. And then finally defining a plan, which is just the process of bringing it all together into something that's more cohesive. There was multiple things that happened, starting with the city tour of the different development projects throughout Quito, then a symposium with researchers and academics in Ecuador and all the participants, and then starting with mapping and understanding what's being most. Then when we started actually working with the community, we split up into 4 different groups. A group that did policy and planning and looked at how these things could be performed within Ecuador and within the specific county that they're in the county. Then dwellings, looking at more housing typologies, communities, so how did that community at the scale of their neighborhood, and then city, what are the connections back to the main capital city and to other areas where they have jobs and where they might go to school. At the end of each phase, we went through a process of reflecting on things and summarizing them, and then went back to the community with what they call the portfolio of options, which is basically just a series of exercises in which you get to that consensus where they understand what their dreams look like within their actual property boundary. Then again, reflecting on that, and in most situations, they enter the final exhibition in which they have some form of a plan or a couple alternative plans that they can choose from which to develop. So I'm going to start just with like what we did with diagnosing. The site that we were on is about a 13-hectare site. It's a peri-urban site, so a lot of these people do migrate back into the city on a daily basis for jobs. And some of them for school. Some of the kids actually travel about 2 hours to get to school every day. That's not about lack of access to education in the areas they live in, but about access, to better education in the cities. The current site it's an informal settlement. They started taking over the site about 7 years ago, and the process of how to take over and how to legalize informal settlements in Ecuador has changed. It could be an hour-long talk just on that. But basically, you don't have to occupy the site now to go through a legalization process, but they do have part of the people on site. So there's about 310 members that are signed up to eventually occupy this. So we have about 310 households, but only about 62 families currently live on the site. In our mapping exercises, we found that the areas in which they occupied were very much along the border of the map. That you see here, in that a lot of that had to do in conversations we found that a lot of it had to do with creating a secure boundary, a space in which the people in the neighboring areas around couldn't invade, and the way they legalize and take possession of the land is by doing agriculture. So they are using and actively making that land produce something. So it also allows them to create a barrier so that the people in the neighborhoods don't come in and steal their potatoes. They've had a lot of people who stealing their potatoes in the past. And other things, I'm sure, also. So in that map, we looked at very physical things that were there. how do they get access to water and electricity? Since it is not a formal site, they are, let's say, borrowing electricity. And they set up their own electric line within there, and then they have 2 hoses, and they literally are like 2-inch hoses that run along the site, and off of that, they pull for each of the houses, which there's only so much water that can run through a hose, so that creates a lot of issues, which I'll get into in the next slide, with the northern and southern parts of the site in terms of access to resources. Then we looked at perceptions. What do people actually perceive of the space they're living on? And we found that this community actually had 2 groups. There is a previous leadership and a current leadership, and there's a lot of conflict within that again, I won't get into in too much detail, but some of those are also from the physical presences of the lack of access to things like water. Most of the water gets used up by the people on the top, so very little of it trickles down, which only enhances the social issues that currently exist on that site. And then looking at relationships between people. Where do the leaders live? Where do kids play? Where do they do agriculture? Where do they, how do they get onto the site and off of the site? Where do they wash their clothes? And the next phase, so that was just about understanding. We started with just understanding how things work on the site. In the next phase, we looked at dreaming. We went through a series of exercises. And this is where we split into the 4 groups. I specifically was on dwelling, so I'm going to cover a lot more of what we did with dwelling. But at the same time, simultaneously, people in community and city and policy and planning were trying to understand the dreams that this group and those females had. We started with dreaming through drawing. So we asked people to draw their dream home. We didn't give them any parameters other than just draw. And what we were trying to look at is what rooms did they draw? Did they draw the social spaces first? Were they drawing any kinds of agriculture? How do they talk about their spaces? And as they drew, we would also ask them questions about how do they plan to build this home? What materials would it be made out of? And a lot of what we found is a lot of people started with the boundary of their home. They set their boundary. A lot of them then proceeded to drawing social spaces, the kitchen and the dining room being very important as places that they could bring their family into and invite friends over. And then they also had bedrooms. And then there was also a large difference that I found very interesting between when you asked the adults. The adults dreamed within boundaries. They dreamed, but they were very realistic about their dreams. It was more about what they needed. Whereas the kids, the picture on the top is this group where we actually asked kids to draw their dream home. They wanted a bathroom and a bedroom for every kid in the house, and there was like 6 of them, which is fun. And then also looking at relationships. Did they draw roads? Did they speak of access to the home? Taking these, we went back to our apartments and made little models that represented the types of rooms and spaces that they had drawn in their drawings, and we made little scaled models and brought them back another day and had them actually set up their homes and talk to them again, very much the same types of questions but different conversations, and we're trying to see what types of trends came up in the conversation. So gardening became a very big issue when they could see it in a 3-dimensional form. And again, that social space aspect. In this case, what happens in Ecuador is you actually tend to have, most rooms are individual. So you have a kitchen, you have a dining room, you have a living room. You don't see a lot of open floor plans. And we tried to ask about, what would they be accepting of that or not? Would they be interested in it? And we found that there was a lot of willingness to combine the living room and the dining room, or the dining room and the kitchen, but never all 3. They were seen very much as having different purposes within the space. In agriculture and green space on the exterior became very important. Using these, we developed typologies. So again, scaling up and trying to clean these models up. What you see in the first box is just extra blocks that we had with us that they could use to expand upon the typologies that we had brought with us. In the second one, a plan that's much more of an indigenous type plan, which has an exterior wood cooking kitchen, in open rooms but covered by a common roof. The population on this site has people that have lived in the city, migrated into the city for a long time, and also more indigenous populations that still cook on wood and farm and are more intense way than the city dwellers do. In number 3, you see just a single-family home, but that is much smaller to allow for them on their plot to have more garden space. And 4, a combination where you could build vertically, and therefore, again, have more internal space, but also exterior space. And 5, which was a larger floor plan, but with the idea that these may be expanded vertically. And we went through a series, we talked with groups in this case. We did this on a Saturday since a lot of the people live off-site. We actually got the opportunity to talk to a lot more people when we went on the weekends than when we were there during the week. And very strongly opinions came out about the ability to expand vertically was key because it's really related to their livelihoods. If they can build up, they can build a space for their daughter or son to live in, and it's also a place where they can retire and then their kids can take care of them. So being able to build vertically was key. A lot of other things that came up in talking about how these dwellings could develop was they really did not want to share spaces. They wanted to be able to have more space to grow gardens, and they wanted the ability, some of them wanted the ability to have a ground floor business, a kindergarten or a wood carpentry store or a grocery store. So being able to combine their living space and livelihood became very important. And then very briefly, a couple of slides of what the community group did. They took photographs or they took cameras and asked participants to go around and take pictures of the spaces they liked or did not like. We talked about what were the desirable aspects and not. Security, cleanliness, 2 things that they really desired that they didn't feel they had at the moment, and wanting to have community and social spaces to create a more unified place once they built, were also very much expressed. Mapping places, and I'm sorry, a lot of this stuff is in Spanish, because it comes from our report. Looking at what are the existing spaces and what are future spaces. And in this case, we were looking at an informal settlement that really is not occupied, so the future spaces and the conversations about how those can happen became much more predominant. They also did an exercise with drawing, how do you draw your neighborhood and what types of social spaces do you want in your neighborhood. Schools became very important, healthcare centers, police, sports spaces, soccer fields, and a place to play aqua volley, which is just an aquarium version of volleyball-ish, became very important. So in speaking to them about, when you isolate the groups and speak to them only about community or only about dwelling, they have more community-minded goals. But then we got to the developing phase, which is really about bringing all of these things together. What happens when dwelling and community have to happen? You have a limited site and a large number of people to put on that site. So, trying to develop consensus, we took the different types of housing that had been discussed, the different types of community spaces that had been discussed, and drew up different types of community models or block models. Some that had single-family homes on about a 200-meter plot, some that had vertical housing, others that shared party walls, and went through and asked them, do you like this one? And we talked about each one of these isolated, so they got to rank every single one. And they were asking, do you like this type of housing block? Do you not like it? Are you neutral about it? To try to understand the spectrum in which they might be able to fit their housing. And then we did what was a portfolio of options. For me, this was one of the things that I really looked forward to. I've never done development work in this way, and the portfolio of options is where we brought everything together. The policy and planning and figuring out how can they get money to build this space? Who's going to build streets? Who's going to build roads? How are they going to finance it? When is it going to happen? How do they legalize? The city had been looking at, where do they work? Where do they go to school? What do they want access to? What is happening in the city that they think they might be able to develop in their own neighborhood, get people to come to their neighborhood? So we met just as a team and downloaded and understood what the other groups had done, and then made different chips on policy and planning. They do feel like Post-it notes and it's all words and stuff hard to represent. And we made chips, and we had a model that you saw in the previous picture that they were going to lay everything out on. And we took that to them with guiding principles that came from the conversations that we had with them. So we started and said, Alex, who's a researcher at UCL, the Bartlett Planning Unit in London, and a professor there, walks them through, this is what you told us over the last 2 weeks that you wanted. And now you have all these things now, it's from the game. Come and lay these out on their plot. And they have 13 hectares, and they've been told they can fit all 310 people on there, which is true if you have a flat plan with no, ravines. They have a very steep slope on their site that really is not buildable. So as we started putting things out, it became very obvious that they could not build all the space that they wanted as single-family homes. And trying to build that consensus was a very difficult process. A lot of that came from the social issues that they are currently having on the site. So I think as a methodology, while it might be good in this application, we found it to be very difficult because it was just flat out no accepting of a consensus, which is a good lesson in development work. And sometimes I came away from it thinking, as much as you might want to go in and you think you're helping them build and develop towards their dreams, you realize that we all dream bigger than we can afford, and we don't always accept that we have to run back. I think some of the social issues that they're going through right now have a very big influence on what's happening there, and that we have to respect those. Understanding that there's currently conflicts, and that is what makes them want their own individual space is very important. And also understanding that they see this process of legalization, the ability to have their own little plot of land as key, because it is their future livelihood. There is no retirement system in Ecuador. The Social Security you get $25. And the cost of living in Ecuador is cheaper than it is here, but it's not that much cheaper in certain aspects. And being able to respect that and find a plan becomes very important. So while we didn't end up with a definite plan after that, we did start defining a plan. So for the exhibition, we summarized a lot of the work we had gone through with them. And in the past, they had done an exhibition which just shows them the different types of plans that they can follow. In our case, we decided to take a different approach and collect more information, maybe on an individual scale, as to what they would dream of and what they were willing to give up and what they were not willing to give up to reach the goal of having all 310 households on the 13 hectares. So we went through different exercises, again at the different scales, some of them combining things. And just to kind of conclude, 5 or 6 people stayed on too with this site, and then Joaquin stayed on and have been working with the community for the last 6 months and trying to further develop plans and working with the city and working with the municipality of Machachi. And this is just a picture. Over Christmas, I got to go home again, and we went out and did Christmas gifts on Christmas Eve. And we were invited into their homes. They definitely built relationships with these people, and then just none of this could I have done alone. I was very much a part of a group, and it was Architects Without Borders. And these are all the people who are working on those.
Thank you to both of you. So now we have opportunities for questions. So I guess we'll kick things off and then we'll open the floor. I have a question for it seems like, Heather, in your presentation, you're talking about kind of trying to figure out a way to design organically within a community. And then, Sarah, you're kind of tracing this the way that money travels into a community that might be similar to this. And it's interesting to see, looking at kind of the remittance landscape, how money kind of influences how architecture is built. So looking at kind of the radius of replication that you discussed, taking a photograph of something that you saw when you were in the U.S. and wanted to build. And it seems like there's a lot of contrast between that impact and what Heather's trying to describe in terms of organic development of community design. I wonder if you could speak to why that might be. Is it just that there's more money? Is it that these people see more diverse experiences? Or if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I'm not sure the extent to which migration is influencing your site, but the money and the fact that that flow of capital is having that impact architecturally is totally linked to the fact that it's coming from these migration processes. So it's the work that's being done that's distanced from that site, that's being done here in the US, is attached to and associated with all kinds of other transformations and changes. With informal settlements, you know, it seems to me that it's not speaking directly about the same kind of process. It's not talking necessarily about a site of high migration or immigration where it would have that access to that capital coming from afar. So the architectural changes there would just be really distinct.
And I think, yeah, I mean, that's true. It's more actually about not migrating, right? In case of the city, right? It is that organic development that you're talking about, and like the ability to settle and stay there forever. Unlike, I mean, if you buy homes here in the US, I think it's like an 8-year changeover or something. It's much quicker when you buy a home and it's all about resale value. Whereas there, it's all about being able to stay there and, but it also is about, I think it does maybe tie into the ability to produce that capital to change your home and grow your home.
Where is it going to come from?
Where is it going to come from? You know, is it going to come from having a shop on the ground floor, and I'm a carpenter, I can have a shop on the ground floor, I can produce more instead of having to migrate, or having to drive an hour into the city and spend more money to rent a facility that I have to access every day. So it really is, it's in a different way, all that money, all of it.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think why is a really interesting question, and I'm from India and I did a very similar study for my undergraduate research, but I was looking at it more from an energy perspective. We were looking at the vernacular community in South India, and where there has actually been a lot of change, and I feel like that change is partly because of sort of these changing occupations within the community, changing. In India, it's a lot of internal migration where kids grow up in rural areas and they move to the city. It's a change from the agrarian economy to a more service-oriented economy. So as we move to the city, we get to see a lot of urban architecture, which was really thing. But just the fact that once you have more money, so you can build these urban farms is I think more of a prestige issue than anything else. So even though we found that they're obviously much less efficient from an energy perspective as compared to the vernacular alternatives, it's not an issue, but I think that's part of it.
Really interesting that you say that, because one of the huge conversations we had when we talked about, rather than this, when we were talking about the materials out of which they built, Adobe is very traditional in my opportunity for good in terms of performance and how they built, but it's got an association with content and an association with being stuck forever in a lower class. Whereas they all wanted, they talked about maybe just basic concrete with CMU infill, and brick it had before it. With brick has slightly more of those thermal properties, and it goes cold. It might be uncredited, it's 10,000 feet above sea level. It's twice the height of Denver. So the cultural connotation there, telling somebody that you should go to the building because it performs better from an energy standpoint, is culturally wrong, because you're suppressing it and trying to tell them they can stay in poverty.
I have a question about the tool ethnography, basically, that both of your projects share in common. Is ethnography, do you think, maybe it's more for you, but I think both of you are invested in that method of looking at different routes. Is ethnography better as a mapping device than as a generative design tool, or what's the reference, or what's the link between the two?
I don't use ethnography as a generative design tool.
Right, you're using it as a mapping tool, yes.
Right, so you're right about that. But I can definitely say that it is a very useful method for mapping, because it allows you to contextualize the material world in a way you wouldn't otherwise be able to. But maybe in terms of generating maybe that's some of the conflicts that you guys came across.
Yeah, and well,
But that's your processes
but
of
there was
never
the process
acting.
of the indigenous versus the non-indigenous, and there was part of a large conflict on site because a lot of the previous leadership group is indigenous population, a lot of the current leadership group is not. And when we were doing the typologies exercise and sharing with, well, this one we would walk them through what each little type of house had, this one has an exterior cooking. We don't want that, we don't want the smoke, we don't want the pigs that come up it, we don't want the smells, fire hazards are not hazards, but could potentially become one. So they were very much against it, so I don't know if that answers your question, but it's definitely, it's a conflict still split people apart. The different, so your generative food, I think it would take a while changing certain cultural, changing your cultural acceptance of more indigenous forms and having them understand them maybe more from their perspective, something like that. That's a cultural shift, right?
Yeah, that's where I think that what you're generating with ethnography would have to go through another process to figure all that stuff out. It's just, it's used all the time, and I think it always, I mean, it typically sort of recreates what people are already expecting, and I think we just need to be aware of that as designers and people hoping to make things better, not just status quo.
And I think there are some really exciting projects in Latin America that look at ethnography or look at traditional forms and modern forms of combining successfully with this criticism.
I had something, we both got into pretty deeply into social issues, and I'm interested in kind of your reflections on identity, specifically like I versus we, or self versus group, and kind of where these interventions are coming from. In your case, it's sort of a pseudo-insider intervention where somebody who's from the area is migrated, is no longer there, is funding the intervention of something within the area. And yours is sort of pseudo-outsider, where you have a group that's kind of learning what this culture is valuing and what they might want to do as a group, and then it kind of turns into this, well, I want to have my own space and it has to be separate because it's not security for business or retirement and family. So I'm curious about this kind of role of identity and where the intervention comes from within these
Yeah. Well, I think that was a great comment. In addition to sort of being a question, that's just a great comment because it points to the fact that where these changes are coming from has to do with the transitional nature of people themselves who are making the changes. So when you use the term pseudo-insider, which I think is interesting because there is that way in which when you're an immigrant and you leave your hometown, you yourself go through transformation, right? So that you're no longer of the place and maybe quite the same way you were before you had ever left. So then that distance, because of having left, what position does that leave you in vis-a-vis that hometown people you remain, right? Do they still consider you as one of the community, as someone who belongs there? And you yourself, you consider yourself as one of the community, as someone who belongs there. And one of the things I look at is the extensive ambivalence that migrants start to undergo because they are having a hard time answering that question for themselves as they have lived in the United States for longer and longer periods of time and might still go back periodically and might still plan on retiring there, might even go back for 5 or 10 years, but always with this question in their mind of where their future lays. So and then in terms of, just one last thing I'd say is, in terms of a more general comment about identity, there, in some ways, the remittance landscape and building and having the surplus capital is really allowing the landscape to become more individualistic. So that you are seeing what previously, and there's not a one-to-one correlation, so a homogeneous environment before meant that there was, a happy community that all got along. But you are seeing the kind of dismantling of a homogeneous built environment, where there wasn't as much of symbolic value, to point back to your comment, in building a house that stands out, on its own. And now there really is.
We'll take one final question.
I guess this question is for Heather. I'm being also from Ecuador, I've always wondered, I've always thought Adobe, first of all, very for energy purposes, the best thing you could do, but also even the style and everything is much more nicer than these big cement blocks that, like in Mexico, we also have that in Ecuador a lot as you drive along the roads. But do you think that the Adobe construction trait, I guess, is being lost? Because that's something that I've always thought, like, I guess as people, as the masters kind of age, there's not really a lot of.
I would imagine so. I mean, I really don't know.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. I would imagine so, just because like our generation isn't building that way anymore. For the last 10, 20 years after the construction forms have really changed. And the only place you still see it, the only place you see Adobe being built is in really wealthy homes. So the really wealthy in our own, one of the ladies who's over on the edge over there was actually in Ecuador helping build Adobe homes.
So there is
she wanted to
still.
learn how to do it, but it was I want to say the guy was Italian or something, and he bought a piece of property. You see a lot of people retiring in Ecuador right now because the cost of living, from a food standpoint, can be lower. It has increased. I'm always horrified at how much it's gone up. So we do see a lot of Americans. There's colonies of Americans moving to the U.S. From the U.S. to Ecuador right now, and they're building homes that are more like Adobe and stuff. But I don't think you see as much in the indigenous population. And even when you go out towards this is that the houses you see being built right now don't have, even when you go way out, they don't build in Adobe anymore. So I would guess that yes, it's being lost.
Actually, I do study the making of Adobes and bricks. I just didn't know. But if I can just say one thing,
The question was for you then.
It's interesting because in Mexico, in Jalisco and some of the areas that I've moved around, some of the areas I've looked at, ironically, the production of Adobe is now actually starting to be supported by remittances also, even though most people are building with Firebrick and CMU but it has a new niche market for some people that want, migrants who themselves want this kind of classic return to the Adobe architecture that they grew up in, right? And they're modifying it, they're making it two-story, but they're using Adobe, so it's actually more expensive. It is still currently being produced, but it's more expensive than even Firebrick.
That's good news.
Okay, so thank you again to Sarah and Heather.